Okay, so we're going to look at a few different viewpoints. And I'm going to actually start with one which is essentially not really an Islamic view, but just for completeness, and because we'll kind of come back to it later to compare it. But this view is essentially called pantheism. Okay, so pantheism is basically the view that this world that we're in, the whole universe, the universe is God. Okay, so God is the world and the world is God. That's what pantheism says, all right? And this view is basically saying that God has basically become this world. He is fully in this world and there is nothing else essentially. This world is God. There's nothing further. There's nothing more to God than this world, okay? And this is a very old view. A very sort of old civilizations used to basically think of, you know, the sun and the earth and the moon and all of this is just a god, and then they broke it up into more than one god. But basically, it believes that that's what we are a part of. Okay, so then we even individual things in the world become a part of God, and God is the whole. There's a collection of all of the things in the universe. That's what we mean by God. There's a lot of people even today who hold this view, okay, of God. Now, what are the problems with it? It doesn't really work from an Islamic point of view, and hopefully by now you will be immediately able to spot the initial problem that we have, based on everything that we've talked about in our philosophy discussion so far, right? The whole point of looking at the wajib al-wujud was because we said that the whole universe is mumkin, right? Even the laws of physics is mumkin. It still needs something wajib to give it existence. So this view that the universe is God doesn't achieve that. You see, it doesn't introduce a wajib. We established from the beginning that the universe as a whole is still a collection of contingent entities. It's just a collection of mumkins. You cannot explain that or call that God because it still needs something to bring it into existence. So that's one problem. And then even if we were to grant that, you know, what kind of God would this be? This is a God that is born and it goes up through change and it decays, and everything that happens in the world would be affecting God, and God would be a very limited being effectively, right? So these are kind of obvious problems with this view, but I wanted to make sure we do cover it. And I will summarize it where this view essentially says that God is entirely immanent in the world. He's in the world, and there is nothing beyond that. And that's all there is to it. It's a view focused entirely on what is called immanence, right? Being in something. Okay, so that's viewpoint number one. Now, viewpoint number two is a view that says, no, God is not like that. God is a great being, but his being has limits and he has form. Okay, now you'll be surprised maybe that this is an Islamic view. Okay, I mean, surprising because most people, I think, don't believe that God has any kind of a form, right? An Islamic view typically doesn't have that. But actually, this is the Salafi view of God, okay, promoted primarily by Ibn Taymiyyah. And they say two main things about God and the nature of God. The first is that they believe God has a body, okay, lahu jismun, okay, and it's based on a very literal, harfi reading of the Quran, because of course the Quran does refer to body parts when it talks about God, right? It says Yadullah, it talks about Wajhullah, and so on, right? So the hand of God, the face of God, it's talking about body parts, right? And so they take a very literal reading and say, yeah, look, he has a body and he has these parts. It includes hands, feet, face, legs. It has size to it. Okay, it actually has a size. But they qualify the statement by saying له جسم ولكن ليس كالأجسام. So he has hands, but they're not like other hands. He has feet, but not like other feet. Right? So it's a body, but it's a different type of body than that we see around us. Okay, so but he has a body, and more than that, they believe that in this viewpoint, the understanding is that God is not everywhere. Okay, I think for a lot of people this would be surprising to hear someone say this, but they genuinely say God is not everywhere. ليس في كل مكان. Okay, they believe that God is located above the world, sitting literally on his throne, on his arsh. Okay, he is actually up there above the sky, sitting. جالس قاعد على عرش. Right, so he is there, not here. Right, he's not here. He's only over there. So again, a very kind of clear understanding of God as a body, which is, if you have a body, then you will be located in a specific place. And again, this is a very, very direct reading of the Quran. Right? Quran says, ثم استوى على العرش. Right? He sat on the throne. And that's it. They're saying this is what the Quran says, and that's what we will take. We're not going to allow ourselves to try to change the meaning of what God is saying. It's a very literal, direct reading of the Quran. The second thing is that they insist on God's being as being limited. Okay, mahdud. And this is very important to them. The reason is, okay, so فَلَهُ حَدٌّ is a very, they're very adamant about this. It's very important to them to say that God is up there in the sky, above the sky, sorry, sitting on his throne, and literally his being stops there. So God's being does not extend below the arsh. It is only up to the arsh, not below the arsh. Okay, and they insist on this not because you have to have a limit of some kind, but because their understanding is that if his being has no limit, okay, then that means that he must also be in all of his makhluqat, all of his creation, which is called hulul, right? This view, this concept with the word in Arabic, hulul, means for something to be in something else, right? Within something else. And so they say, look, if you say that God's being doesn't have a limit to it, then it ends up being in his creation. There's no separation between one and the other. So it becomes one and the other. So that's why his being must be limited to create this division between him and his creation. And it's a very important kind of principle for them. In fact, I was surprised to see this book, for example, which is dedicated, an entire book, to establishing that God has a limit. إثبات الحد لله. Okay, and establishing that he's not here, he's up there. He doesn't have his being is not here. Okay, and if you were to enter discussions with Salafis about this point, their entire focus is on the Quran. It's a very, very direct, literal reading of Quran, and they twist the thing around to you and say, if you don't agree with this view, those are your words, they're not God's words. God's words tell us that he is up in the sky, and that he has a body and has these parts. So we can either listen to you or we can listen to God's own words. Okay, so that's their response. So this is one perspective. And it's also an overall attitude which says that our thinking is very limited, right? Our minds are limited, and we should not think about these things. Okay, they summarize it in a phrase. They say al-iqrar wal-murur. Okay, al-iqrar wal-murur. Iqrar means accept what God has said in the Quran. Iqrar, you accept it, you acknowledge it. And murur, just keep going. Just keep reading the Quran. Don't think, don't ask, don't try to understand these things, because we cannot. We just have to accept. Okay, so it's an overall attitude about what the mind is able to do and what our approach should be. Okay, so that's a viewpoint. Now, I would say it's still a minority view, but you'll be surprised how many people do have this understanding of God as having a body and being located in a place and having limits. All right, so that's viewpoint number 2. Now, viewpoint number 3 is, I would say, the traditional majority view. Okay, this is what most people believe, which is that God is a transcendent being, right? And I'll explain what we mean exactly by that. Transcendent being separate from his creation. Okay, so he's transcendent means that God is beyond his creation, right? He's not subject to anything that limits its creation. So this is the traditional view. It does not take a literal reading of the Quran, right? So when God says ثُمَّ اسْتَوَى عَلَى الْعَرْشِ, this is interpreted to mean something else. It doesn't mean he's literally sitting on his arsh. It means that it is symbolizing God's domain and dominion over, mulk, his power over all of creation, as summarized by this throne as a symbol. The arsh is a symbol. So the whole thing gets interpreted symbolically and avoid this idea that God has body parts. When it says Yadullah, the hand of God, it represents the power of God, right? So God's power is above the power of human beings, right? Yadullah fawqa aydihim, for example. So there's an interpretation happening at ta'weel, right? And most people, I think, are comfortable taking that step. Okay. It also claims that God has no limits and is not located in any specific location, right? So again, not that God is in a specific place. He is, you can say, everywhere, or you can also say he is nowhere. He's not subject to place. So he is not limited in any way. And so that's what we mean by transcend, okay? Munazzahun an khalqih, is beyond his creation. All right, so so far, I think most of you would probably nod and say that's my understanding of God. And also, similar to viewpoint number 1 and 2. Sorry, I should have said viewpoint. This should read viewpoint number 2. The claim is that God is a being. Okay, huwa mawjudun. He's a divine being, right? He's a creator being, but he is a being, just like we are beings. He is also a being, but a very special being. Okay. And generally, the understanding of how God creates the world is that he creates everything out of nothingness, right? خلق الأشياء من العدم. This is the kind of phrase that summarizes it. This is not from the Quran itself. There's nowhere in the Quran which says خلق الأشياء من العدم, but this is the understanding that before God created the world, they did not exist. There was nothingness. They were Adam, and he creates everything out of that nothingness, out of Adam. He turns Adam into wujud. Okay, so that's the process of how the creation happens. But here's some initial issues with that. So I'm going to kind of highlight some of the problems with this traditional view. Okay, and then next week we'll go into another viewpoint. But essentially, what this does, effectively, this view implies that God's being does have a limit, okay, in the sense of being separate, munazil, from the being of his creation, right? There's a separation between, that's what tanzih leads to. If you say that God is transcendent, that actually introduces a limit in the sense that God's being is separate from others. So there must be a limit that separates them. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. So this is implicit. It's not intended. If you ask someone, does God have limits? They will say no. But then when you ask them, well, what about this tanzih? You know, if there's a difference between the God and his being and his creation, then you're creating a division, which means that there is a limit implied by that separation. Okay, so in other words, God is a being, okay, and is separate from other beings that exist alongside them. Okay, so he is the creator, but they are mawjudat, and he is a mawjud. And so in that sense, they exist alongside him, even though they are created by him, right? And this is understood. This is in the literature. This is summarized as something called Tawheed al-Adadi. Okay, it's a Tawheed, but it's a Tawheed al-Adadi. Okay, it's a numerical understanding of God's oneness. Right, He is one being, one creator being. Right. And so overall, this view, the pantheistic view, was entirely focused on immanence, right? God is in the world, and that's all there is. This view is the exact opposite of pantheism, right? This exact opposite. God is entirely transcendent, beyond this world. Okay. So this just summarizing what this is. Now, I'm going to introduce what I think are, well, I'm going to raise some issues with this view, and then hopefully we can build on it and develop it further, okay? But this idea of Tawheed al-Adadi, all right, implies that God's being is limited, all right? That's what it ends up doing. It's saying, yes, he's one God, but you know, that means that his being must end at some point in order to allow for other beings to exist alongside. Okay, so God can be counted alongside other beings. There's no way to avoid that. If you say there are two things and they're both real, then they limit each other. There's no way to avoid that conclusion. All right. And what it does, this Tawheed al-Adadi, leaves open the possibility of a second or more entities. Okay, so even if you say there is only one God, it doesn't prevent the possibility of a second. Right? Tawheed al-Adadi yaqbal al-thani, right? It allows the possibility. It's just the case that there happens to only be one God, but there's nothing logically that prevents from a second, because his being ends at some point, right? That's what we're saying, that something else starts, that's his creation. That means the possibility is there. There's only one entity, but one in a numerical sense allows for two, allows for three, allows for four, right? That's what we mean by a numerical oneness, all right? And the problem with that is that as soon as you introduce limit, and we said this many times in the last few sessions, anytime you introduce a limit of any kind to anything, then you introduce imkan, this contingency. And anything that's mumkin, again, becomes something that's not eternal, that it needs something else to bring it into existence, right? So it's called huduth. Huduth means that it's created. It's not eternal. It was brought into existence, right? Anything that has limit is like that. And what I'll do now is cover a few hadiths from Imam Ali about Tawheed that kind of point to what I've been saying. Now, what I'm doing here is really not focusing on him as an authority that we have to, follow exactly what he's saying. I'm not doing that here at this stage. I'm just taking his words, because even if you didn't know who he was, you would see that he has said some of the most amazing, the deepest understanding of Tawheed is in the words of Imam Ali. So I'm not appealing to him as a particular authority or saying this hadith is sahih or not or whatever. That's irrelevant. This could be anybody, anonymous, saying these words. I'm listening to the wisdom in the words rather than who is saying it, right? انظر إلى ما قيل ولا إلى ما من قال, right? So focus on what is being said, not who is saying it. It just happens to be Imam Ali who, as I said, has said some of the most amazing things about Tawheed. So here are a few hadiths that I'm going to just touch on. These are just sort of little nuggets from some of his khutbas, okay? So first one, it says, Al-Ahad, and I'll have to translate in English as we go along, okay? Al-Ahadu bila ta'wili adad. Okay, so he's using the word ahad, right? Like Qul huwa Allahu ahad, and I'll talk about that particular name and what it really means and what's the difference between ahad and wahid. We'll talk more about that later, but the key here is he's saying that he is ahad, but not in the with an interpretation of number. It's not a numerical understanding that there is one God. One as a number. It's not that. That's not what he means. He says, Al-Wahidu la bi'adad. Again, he's one, but not numerically. He's not numerically one. La yushmalu bihaddin wa la yuhsabu bi'addin. Okay, so he is not subject to any limit. That's why I keep talking about limits, because the Imam talks about limits. He says he cannot be subject to any limits, and he cannot be counted with any number, even the number one. Okay. He also says, وَمَنْ حَدَّهُ فَقَدْ عَدَّهُ وَمَنْ عَدَّهُ فَقَدْ أَبْطَلَ أَزَلَهُ. Okay. So whoever limits him has numbered him, right? So this is exactly the comments that I have, in those bullet points. As soon as you put a limit, then you have entered into the realm of numbers, okay? And as soon as you put him as a number, then you have you have introduced createdness into him. He's no longer eternal. Abtala azala, right? So no longer eternal. Why? Because of this point that anything that has a limit is a mumkin, and anything that is mumkin is not eternal and is therefore created. Right? That's the flow of the logic. That's what he's saying. So anyone puts limit on him has numbered him. And if you've numbered him, then he becomes mumkin and becomes non-eternal, which is very serious, right? That's why this understanding of Tawheed is so serious. Because just by a casual understanding, yeah, there's one God, oops, you've made him mumkin. So you have to be very careful about your understanding. Now, there's a really interesting hadith where he's actually in the battle of Jamal, and someone comes to him and asks him about Tawheed. And in fact, the people around him say, what are you talking about? He's about to go to battle and you're asking him about Tawheed. And he answers and he says, it's a long hadith. I haven't included all of it. I've only taken a part of it. But he says to him, Ya Arabi, inna al-qawli fi anna Allah wahidun ala arba'ati aqsam. Okay, there's 4 ways in which you can say God is one. Okay, 4 ways. فوجهان منها لا يجوزان على الله. Okay, ووجهان يثبتان فيه. So there's 4 ways of understanding this Tawheed. 2 of them are acceptable, 2 of them are unacceptable. Okay, now I'm only again going to cover the first one, but this is what he says. He says, فأما اللذان لا يجوزان عليه. Right, so this is the unacceptable understanding of Tawheed. فقول القائل واحد يقصد به باب الأعداد فهذا ما لا يجوز. Okay, so someone who says God is one and he means the number 1, then he's talking about a numerical oneness, right? Bab al-A'dad, entering into the numbers. Then this is not acceptable. So understanding that God is one being is not acceptable. Why? لأن ما لا ثاني له لا يدخل في باب الأعداد. Okay, because something that there's no second, there's no possibility of a second, cannot be counted in the numerical sense. Okay, and this point is going to be something we'll focus a lot on probably in the next session, but this point of ma la thaniya lahu, okay, no second entity is there, then you cannot count it in a numerical sense. That's not the right understanding of oneness. Okay, so this is Tawheed al-Adadi, and I would say these are comments that are kind of telling us, look, be careful about this Tawheed Adadi. These are the implicit problems that come with it. There's a deeper way of understanding. The other thing that is problematic about this Tawheed al-Adadi is this issue of uzla, separation, right? So we said that the traditional understanding is that Allah is munazzah, right? He's beyond, he's separate from his creation. So this is the word uzla, separate, right? And this is also problematic when you look at the Imam's words. So a couple more things I'll share here. This is a beautiful hadith that's very, very deep. He says, وَتَوْحِيدُهُ تَمْيِيزُهُ عَنْ خَلْقِهِ. Okay, so Tawheed, this understanding of God's oneness, is to differentiate between him and his creation. Tamyiz, you have to distinguish, differentiate. Okay, mayyiz, distinguish between the two, differentiate. Okay, that's fine. But then how do we differentiate? And he says, وَحُكْمُ التَّمْيِيزِ بَيْنُونَةِ صِفَةٍ لَا بَيْنُونَةِ عِزْلَةٍ. Okay, so this differentiation, this difference is not based on them being separate from each other. There's no separation. It's a differentiation like an attribute of something. All right, so if we think about 2 objects, right, 2 separate objects, this pen and this ball, they are separate from each other. Right? 2 separate entities. So how do I differentiate between them? Well, it's very clear. There's a separation between these 2 things, right? But if I take this pen itself and I look at the color of the pen, right? The pen and the color of the pen are 2 different things, right? They're 2 different concepts. You have the pen and you have the color of the pen. Yeah, the pen is the object. The color is an attribute of the object. Right? There are 2 different things. So you have to differentiate between the pen and the blackness of the pen. But that blackness is not separate from the pen. You see? The blackness of the pen and the pen itself are not separate from each other. but you can differentiate between them. The pen is one thing and the color is something different. And that's what he's explaining, that the way you differentiate between God and his creation is not by thinking of them as two separate objects. Right? بينونة الصفة لا بينونة الاسم. He then says داخل في الأشياء لا كشيء داخل في شيء. Right? So in everything, God is in everything, but not like something being inside something else or entering something else. Okay. وخارج عن الأشياء لا كشيء خارج من شيء. Not so outside of things, but not like something separate or outside of something else. See, if this whole understanding was that God is separate and God is beyond his creation entirely, right? Entirely transcendent, then you wouldn't say داخل في الأشياء. You wouldn't even say خارج في الأشياء. But that first part, داخل, wouldn't make sense if it's a total separation. Okay? And the last one is مع كل شيء لا بمقارنة. God is with everything, but not through a comparison, through a pairing of things. Okay? It's not a pairing of things. It's not two things that are together. وغير كل شيء لا بمزايلة. So he is different from everything, but not by separation. لا بمزايلة, not by separating them. That's not the sense in which he is different from his creation. Okay. So hopefully from all of this, you get a sense of this, traditional understanding has a lot of issues. It doesn't really fit some of these ideas. Now, again, I'm not saying that we need to necessarily focus only on these hadiths. And I'm not going to get into a whole debate about, where these hadiths come from. These are just very deep words that are drawing attention, right? They're drawing our attention to some deep issues that you have to be careful about in your understanding of God, because otherwise, accidentally, right, inadvertently, you will unintentionally actually create problems in the sense of whatever it is, imkan, that you introduced into God without intending to, but your understanding has implied it, or this kind of uzla, this kind of separation, which is not the correct understanding of his relationship with creation. Okay, so all of this I would summarize in the following way. Okay, the traditional view was motivated to try and differentiate between God and his creation, okay, to avoid God becoming similar to his creation, right? Because then he would be imperfect, he would become dependent. He told us, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, right? Nothing is like him. So that's a strong motivation. No Muslim will believe that God is kind of in his creation, like this hulul, right? Pure, like immanence, like in pantheism. And that's why the kind of thinking was, well, then he must be transcendent, must be totally separate, right? And that's what led to this claim. God must be separate. But these were all the problems that came with that, right? It leads to a God whose being is limited. That leads to Tawheed Adadi, a numerical oneness, that then creates problems with, contingency and createdness. And actually, there is a comparison being made, because indirectly, again, not intentionally, but if you say God is a mawjood and other things are mawjoodat, even if you tell me, yeah, but he is a creator mawjood and they are created mawjood, you can still count them, right? You can still count them, right? So if there's 4 of us in a room, you say 1, 2, 3, 4, and God is 5, right? There's a comparison that you're making, your similarity between God and the creation. And effectively, by the way, the other thing is that it leads to domains of inside God and outside God, right? When you say God is beyond the creation, you're saying it's not in God, it's outside of God, because you've created a limit. When you created a limit, one side is in, the other side is out, effectively, right? Again, these are not intentional, but these are the implied results of that view. All right. And then the other part of the problem was that, the motivation was, well, God is eternal. He is azali, right? Everything else must have come into existence by God. Everything else is hadith, right? So that's why we have this very common understanding among people that God must have created everything out of Adam, right? There must have been Adam, non-being, nothingness, and he turned that into the existing things. It's motivated by the idea that only God was there at the beginning, and so everything else must have been Adam, must have been non-existent. But this has a lot of problems with it. Okay, again, it creates an impression of God as having a limited being, adjacent next to some Adam, right? And then he turns that Adam into wujud. That itself is not a very rational thing. It really doesn't make any sense to say that nothing becomes something. Okay? It actually doesn't make sense. That's what we were telling the atheists, that you can't have total nothingness and then turn it into existence. That's nonsensical. Okay. And then the alternative is what? It was Adam, but then it was given wujud, right? That's how we kind of visualize that God, gave wujud to this non-existing things. But where did that wujud come from? Right? At that point, only God existed. Nothing else existed, right? Everything else is Adam. And now that Adam is going to be converted into wujud, where did that wujud come from? Right? Where wujud was created, these things don't make any rational sense, right? So this very simplistic idea that we have that God is almost like a magician and turns nothingness into being, right? Converts it into being, doesn't make any sense. And that's unfortunately the kind of impression that we have grown up with. And so I'm going to stop here by just summarizing that each of these different views that we've looked at have different issues, they're different ways of understanding God. They have some strengths and weaknesses, maybe we can call them that. But we normally, I spent a lot of time on this traditional view because this is the common view. This is the view that most people have. And it's, this is okay as far as it goes, but I believe that if we're interested in going further, there are deeper ways to understand Tawheed that will resolve a lot of these problems and leave us with a better, deeper understanding of the nature of God. And so next week, we'll go into one more viewpoint, which I'll spend some time explaining, which I think resolves a lot of these issues. But for today, I'll stop here. I know I spoke for a long time and I covered a lot of things, but I needed to kind of cover all of this together and not really break it up. So I felt this was the best way to do it, but inshallah, we'll have some good discussions about what we've covered so far. Thank you.